Let's kind of deconstruct it, in this conversation. You see Tijuana, right? Tijuana has conflict in it. There's violence here. There is an ongoing war between rival cartels that are trying to gain control of a local drug market, and they're killing each other's distribution points and sales points, gangland style. There are a few high-level hits that happen. There's executions, there's abductions. That's one side of what's happening in Mexico. Then you go to Michoacan, right? What's going on in Michoacan?
Yeah, Michoacan. So the battle space right now is between the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, the new Jalisco New Generation, and Carteles Unidos, which is basically different factions that have, part of Los Viagras, Familia Michoacana, Caballos Templarios, or the remnants of it.
All of the remnants of the cartels that
the old schools
got together and formed this. Are like, and Michoacan has a history of the autodefensas, which came before that. Which between you and me, the autodefensas were mostly cartel members that kind of like put the T-shirt on of being community policing vigilantes, but they were. It later came out that they were basically doing the same kind of thing, right?
Yeah, and a lot of them were, I think that was enabled by the fact that they were deputized by Peña Nieto. And so, if you were an autodefensa, you were allowed to carry arms, whereas if you're a cartel member, they'll kind of arrest you here and there.
Yeah.
So, it basically incentivized.
It legitimized cartel members or people that were in organized crime that were part of the community. And they legitimized them being armed and policing their community. And then, that kind of, I think that bled into what is happening now, where Carteles Unidos, they call themselves that, which is United Cartels, fighting alongside Mexican federal agencies in trench warfare against the New Generation Cartel. Yeah. Is that kind of like safe to say?
That's what I hear from people that I speak to in Michoacan. There is the idea that Carteles Unidos are very much supported by federal forces, that, Guardia Nacional has, some incentive of keeping them kind of in this fight. This is very much what I hear from the people that witness it and hear it. And then Jalisco Nueva Generación is, supported by another wing. So, it is a war that is becoming heavier and heavier. And also the history of these groups too. They're joined by Milenio. El Mencho, Nemesio Seguerra, was part of Milenio Valencia cartel. So was El Abuelo. Abuelo Farias, who is kind of the head of Tepaltepec cartel.
Yeah.
Cartel, which is, head of the Carteles Unidos. So, when we start deconstructing also the allegiances and the rivalries, you start seeing that they all kind of also come from the same histories, the same lineage. And then Milenio broke up into La Resistencia, Los Torcidos. Out of Los Torcidos came, what eventually became Jalisco New Generation. So there's a lot of history within also these areas too that I think is very informative for how we see it developing now. It didn't just come out of a vacuum.
Yeah. Now, what do you see with New Generation Cartel specifically? You mentioned the historic head of the New Generation Cartel, Nemesio Seguerra Cervantes, who was a former cop. Was it interesting? He was a former cop. The U.S. actually had him in custody for a bit, which is interesting. He's arrested for heroin smuggling, I think. He comes back. He's the head of this New Generation Cartel. We first started hearing about it during mid to late 2000s. I think the first major event that the name at an international level that the New Generation Cartel was named or attached to was them downing a federal helicopter
in 2015.
Over where was this? It was over their controlled territory. They used a Russian RPG on a Black Hawk helicopter donated by the U.S. government to Mexican authorities, flying really low. They didn't realize that these people had anti-aircraft capabilities, and that became the president. Like that's not only still an issue for flying over Mexico as a law enforcement in the military aspect, but they basically escalated the violence in a way in Mexico. So
they set the tone.
They set the tone of what comes next. The aspect of cartel members keeping it low key, maybe the violence would be very prevalent in some places, but they would try and keep a low key and control, maybe not full confrontation with the government. And then they just make a helicopter go down, and gain control over big
swaths of
territory where they themselves are now the government. In a way,
Absolutely.
In some of these areas, they don't go to the police; they go to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're fulfilling these functions that are limited to or what we would expect are limited to the government. During COVID, they were out distributing despensas, like food baskets.
And enforcing mask policy.
Absolutely, and curfews, and it was this level of blatant control of territories. We're not talking small towns, we're talking collective of towns, and people followed it. Why? I think it's worth exploring. I think everybody has different motivations. I think fear is very much high up there, but they started implementing their own kind of government in a lot of these areas. They were distributing despensas, they were enforcing masks, curfews. In Jalisco, they had a flash flood with a few homes, their furniture got wiped away. They were there the next day distributing mattresses and refrigerators. And, for Mother's Day, they go out and distribute microwaves and appliances. And, they are fulfilling a role.
Now, when we talk about cartels, I mean, most people culturally, and people that watch Netflix and the Narcos series and stuff like that, that's the concept or the image that they have of cartels. There's these guys in flashy clothes, maybe operating in cells and paying off and corrupting the military and all this type of stuff. New generation cartel is a different animal in that aspect, or at least that's how it's seen. That's how they've been kind of like differently influencing their whole growth and how they've been taking control of large parts of the Mexican territory. Sinaloa cartel, in comparison to the new generation cartel, can you explain what their differences are as far as how Demoler has been able to kind of cover that?
Yeah, we see that Jalisco cartel has taken huge territories by just absolute force. With some aspect of the Sinaloa cartel, we see, I will hit a new talking point here about their fragmentation, but we saw them still maintain a certain line of control within their areas. I've spoken to a few people in Sinaloa who are just like, no, this is they keep the control. That's why they say that Sinaloa is very low in the homicide. They have a certain degree of just maintaining that status quo, whereas like all of the areas of Jalisco cartel are some of the highest homicide rates that we see. And also the active, conflict areas. They're actively conflicting around or against these local gangs or local, in Guanajuato, they take now Santa Rosa de Lima.
Yeah, Santa Rosa de Lima, yeah. They've taken down they just basically wiped it out.
Yeah. They weakened it so much that before El Marro got arrested, and El Marro is ahead of Santa Rosa, I started seeing a lot of chatter around, some of these cops were turning, and suddenly it was just like, oh, he's not meeting payroll.
Yeah.
And it was those little interesting things that you start picking up on those little details, on those little triggers. And he wasn't arrested by the Mexican authorities. I mean, federal authorities. He was arrested by the
like a state agency.
Yeah.
Which is very interesting.
Very suspect.
Very suspect and very interesting that those were the guys that found him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm not saying that they're not good at their job, but it was interesting that their influence in the area as far as law enforcement and how they were kind of on their side, all of a sudden they turned
Switch.
and they're not there on that side. It's an interesting observation.
Yeah. So this is how you start seeing kind of these areas also start changing, with, the difference between Sinaloa is, we can talk a little bit about also the fragmentation between like El Mayo Zambada side and Los Chapitos. And after the arrest of El Chapo, it started kind of going into two different areas. And so within Sinaloa, we start seeing a lot of infighting as well, which I think is interesting because I think that, the perspective is that these cartels are fighting the rivals. But, there's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of different groups within one cartel in general anyway, that, some guy says something that the other guy didn't like, they say that the fragmentation started between conflict between El Nini and El Ruso. Different, one of El Ruso part of Zambada, Nini part of Los Chapitos. And then so it starts creating a bigger
conflict within the same big cartel.
Absolutely.